the Tillage Tales group. My name is Wayne Lindwall, and I worked at the research station many years ago and retired and doing consulting. This is my colleague Ben Ellert, who's still working, soil scientist, but I was an ag engineer, tillage engineer for more than 25 years, and then I got into soil management and bureaucracy and whatever in Ottawa before I finally retired, but I still do some international consulting.
And we don't hold that against Wayne either.
Yeah.
Not the engineering part or the bureaucracy part.
But anyway, because it's our 150th anniversary coming up this weekend, the organizers from Farming Smarter thought we should talk a bit about some of the history and how we got here. And so they always ask an old guy like me to talk about some of that history, because I experienced some of it, or at least a third of it. But it began about 150 years ago. That's when the settlers first moved out to the prairies from Europe, and actually a couple 100,000 Americans came up when they found they could get a quarter section of land for $10. So they moved to this area of the prairies to start farming. As long as they stayed for 3 years, they didn't have to give their $10 back. But that's really how it all started back in the 1860s or 1870s, and things really rolled along quite smoothly because we had this beautiful grassland prairie that had never been broken, 3% organic matter, quite productive. The crop yields were pretty good in the early years. Obviously you didn't have to use fertilizer because the organic matter from that freshly broken prairie provided enough nutrients to feed the crop, and rainfall was adequate. So we had about 25 or 30 years pretty good for most of the farmers. But then they found out that with the dry conditions, a guy by the name of, what was his name? I guess
Angus McKay.
Angus McKay. So thanks, Ben. Again, Alzheimer's setting in. Angus McKay came in about 1880 and said, if we're going to farm in the Palliser Triangle or the brown soil zone, which we're in here, you're going to have to summer fallow. Basically one crop every 2 years, but you've got to build up your crop moisture reserves over the summer and your nutrients from that decomposition of crop residues. And so summer fallow was pretty much the norm, and it was the recommendation for 60 years pretty much. Back from the turn of the century until 30s and 40s before it started they started questioning it. And as you all know, if you talk to your parents or your grandparents, they'll talk about the dirty 30s and what happened then. With the drought of the 30s, you get 3 or 4 years of dry conditions. And with the summer fallow, the land started moving. So you started getting these dust clouds across the prairies, not just in southern Alberta, but throughout the Midwest and the US as well. So that's why they called it the dirty 30s. So that spurred on the interest in something better. And Charles Noble from Nobleford invented the Noble blade, which you see there in 1937. And he received the Order of British Empire for that invention because it was the first implement that would leave most of the crop residue on the surface and still hopefully kill the weeds during that summer fallow system. Because the discs and the cultivators like this didn't conserve enough crop residue to prevent erosion. Because the strips were getting, even though we were practicing strip farming with the bigger equipment, farmers were going wider and wider. They didn't like their shelter belts anymore, and so we started getting these black blizzards, not just in the summertime, but also in the winter. Because of a Chinook belt, we didn't have enough snow cover, and so a lot of these black blizzards occurred every month of the year, not unlike what you see in that picture. But when we found out in the 60s, it was even drier than it was in the 30s, and we had some more black blizzards, and so people were starting to get pretty panicky. The fields were too big, too intensive of tillage. We'd sort of peaked in summer fallow acreage to, I think, 14 million hectares, or about 29 million acres in the 70s. And again, some of the policies were even encouraging 2 years of summer fallow to reduce our wheat inventories. So you can imagine 2 years of fallow, didn't make a lot of sense from a sustainability question. So some of the government policies didn't help the situation. So the 60s were dry, and then I think what was most dramatic in the 80s, and then when the drought hit again in the 80s, which is actually the drought was worse than the 60s or the 30s. And the 80s hit, and it wasn't till the politicians got involved. Senator Herb Sparrow said something needed to change, and so there was a greater interest in terms of adopting conservation tillage. So again, this is the Noble blade. You can see how much crop residue it conserves. A lot of lawsuits occurred in the 80s particularly. This particular field here was about 8 kilometers from here. This was an irrigated pasture, and upwind was a a quarter section of sandy dry land. And this storm occurred in one day, and that storm basically wiped out that quarter section of irrigated pasture. It was alfalfa, and it wiped that whole quarter section out, filled all the irrigation ditches for 3 or 4 kilometers, and obviously it was kind of a nasty lawsuit. But there was a few of those situations that I had the pleasure, or not so much pleasure, getting involved in at the time. So then we realized we had to do something more. So the government, with Senator Herb Sparrow's report, recommended that we put more research into conservation tillage and give incentives to farm groups to try different direct seeding implements, help the machinery companies develop better seeding equipment. And obviously with the development of Roundup and some other herbicides, it became more economical to even look at chemical summer fallow or direct seeding itself. So that's really what happened. One of my favorite photos here to help illustrate the value of topsoil is, again, to convince farmers the value of topsoil. Sure, you can go and buy topsoil like that for 20 bucks a bag, but you realize how expensive it is when you're buying it for your garden versus the farm. So I always like to have a bag of topsoil when you see what you pay, willing to pay at your garden center for that, and that's mostly water, actually 70% water, so 20 bucks for that bag of soil. But back in what years were this? I think it was...
That was 89, I think?
89. So some of the funding that we got with the soil conservation movement was we stripped this is just not too far from here at the research center, but we stripped the topsoil away about 20 centimeters and trucked in topsoil from all over southern Alberta of different organic matter content, right from 0.5% to 9%. And as you know, the black soil is like 9% organic matter. So we put all that topsoil, 10 tons, each of these are 10 tons of topsoil on these plots to monitor what happens in terms of yield. And so what happens is that, obviously the low end, this is the yield curve, and so until you get up to sort of 2% or 2.5% soil carbon, your yield goes up with that carbon. It really illustrates very visually, how important soil carbon is, or organic matter is, to that soil productivity. So it was good for groups like this when you could see that. You could go out in the field and see the difference in yield and how important soil carbon is in terms of productivity. So that helped illustrate the situation on soil carbon. And so again, we're celebrating 150 years, but it was 50 years ago this year that we started our research on no-till. So about 6 kilometers from here, we have about 5 acres or 2.5 hectares of land that we started in 1967, no-till. And I was a summer student at that point, and so they've kept it in no-till. And as far as I know, it's the longest no-till wheat in North America, if not the world. And that's still going on. So you might want to visit that one of these days as well. So Ben, you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I guess just to reinforce the message of the value of topsoil, in addition to the sort of the pollution aspects and the clogging of highways and irrigation canals, is dollars in the farmer's pocket. And this was a poster that was prepared for a group similar to this in 1947, showing the difference in wheat growth on a place where the soil was allowed to erode away versus where it was not eroded. And in the history of at Lethbridge here, we've got a long history of trying to conserve soil and protect it against erosion. Partly because we're in the Chinook zone with higher winds than a lot of other places. So when the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Program really kicked in earnest in 1935 in response to the drought crisis and the black blizzards illustrated here, Lethbridge already had a bit of a jump at it, and we were looking at ways of summer fallowing, but trying to maintain the residues on the surface. Very important innovation was the movement away from stationary threshing machines, because all this residues would stay on the soil when you move to a combine harvester. The other innovations was what they called trash cover farming, and it wasn't trash, it was really valuable plant residues that we wanted to conserve on the soil surface to prevent it from blowing away or washing away. And that led to some of the developments of the new tillage equipment, especially the Noble Blade. But really, with summer fallow, it was a very efficient means of storing soil water.
Yeah, well, we always thought we summer fallow for that water, but we measured it for so many years, and we figured, well, farmers must be been practicing this for 50 or 60 years. But when we measured, on average, summer fallow conserved only 55 millimeters of water over a 20-month fallow period. 55 millimeters of water, a little over 2 inches. So we go 20 months without growing anything, but we only conserved, on average, 55 millimeters of water, a little over 2 inches. It seems like that's pretty, and so we'd have enough precipitation of, say, 560 millimeters of precipitation, but we'd only conserve 55 of that. So 12% of all of the precipitation that we had over that 20-month fallow period is all we conserved. In addition to that, 55 millimeters of water, but we also built up 55 kilograms of nitrogen from the breakdown of the crop residue, the organic matter, the humus. So that's why farmers didn't have to put much fertilizer for many years on their summer fallow land, because you built up 55 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, nitrate nitrogen. So it's a nice number to remember, 55 millimeters of water, 55 kilograms of nitrogen. That's what summer fallow is all about. But then we started asking ourselves, and we noticed that it was mostly in the fall and early spring that we conserved that moisture. During the fallow year, even with no-till chem fallow, we didn't conserve anything from that May to August period. It's just too much evaporation from our chem fallow. What we did conserve was in the fall or the early spring. So we figured if we could do a better job of keeping the stubble standing in the winter, going into winter, and not touch it in the spring, maybe we could get some of that 55 millimeters by continuous cropping. So we thought that was pretty, we figured even if we could get half of that 55 millimeters or all of that, which we found we were able to do, why would we go 20 months to get that 55 millimeters of water and not grow anything, even if the yields might be a little bit less?
And that's the stumbling block that we often have, and even early when in the 90s, we'd tour farmers through the plots, and they would see a wheat crop on summer fallow, and it was nice and green and lush and a thick crop, and then we'd show them the continuous wheat crop, and it would be a little bit more struggling, not quite as lush, and the farmer says, well, that's the crop that I want to grow. And then we started reminding them, you have to take your yield from that crop and you've got to divide it by 2. And then you compare it with the other crop and put them on even ground. And all of a sudden, the economics and the water use efficiency changed dramatically.
So like I said, we only have 1.6 million acres of summer fallow now on the prairies. But they're still being practiced. And again, I'm not discounting the importance it is for weed control, especially perennial weeds, but for moisture and nutrients, it's just not necessary. And it was heresy to suggest they didn't have to summer fallow. I know the head, or the dean of agriculture, University of Saskatchewan, they demanded he resign when he suggested that farmers didn't need to summer fallow back in the 70s. So it was pretty controversial suggestion that farmers didn't need to summer fallow. And you can understand why, long-term tradition.
Yeah, nowadays we felt it was a good idea to include some examples of summer fallow in our demonstration here, more for the historical aspects of it, plus to illustrate the development of technology. So what we see here is a plot of summer fallow where the weeds have sort of been controlled, but not that well, with a heavy-duty cultivator. So that has sweeps about 16, 18 inches wide, and it's still this sweep cultivator. This is a much more advanced tillage tool, which leaves more of the residues on the surface than some of the earlier implements. But after that came the development of the Noble blade, which essentially undercuts the weeds, and that's what this plot is an example of here. So you see the main soil disturbances where the standards, the supports of those wide V blades go through. And the idea of that is to try to kill the weeds, but expose the minimum amount of soil to evaporation. So you want to keep those residues on there to try to keep the soil anchored and prevention from blowing. In your handout, you have a table that shows the the reduction in surface residue coverage with each tillage pass. And of course, the least destruction of residues by weed control on summer fallow was with the chemical fallow plot, and that's the furthest one over, where you can see there's been no soil disturbance. We're using non-selective herbicides to kill all the vegetation. But those chemicals only became affordable in the late 80s, was it, Wayne?
Yeah, even though we started research back in the 60s, it wasn't economical, but at least it allowed us to prove it in principle. And so when the price of Roundup dropped in the later 80s, especially in comparison to what it would cost to cultivate, we already had 15 years of data, showing that you could do this. It wasn't economical for many, many years, especially chem fallow, because we'd have to spray 3 or 4 times, and you cultivate 3 or 4 times as well, but it was still far more expensive to do chem fallow. It's more, you still see some chem fallow around because it is economical, and Roundup has dropped in price, or the regional facsimiles to Roundup. But we also had to use herbicides that were non-residual, that had no chance of getting in the food chain. So that limited our ability to use different herbicides that were available at the time, because we could have used some nastier ones, but we wanted to use ones that have no chance of ending up in the food chain from an environmental standpoint. So before we walk on the other side, I just want to have a little illustration here about water and how much water it takes to grow a crop. Whenever we have National Water Day, and this was a display I remember using 25 or 30 years ago, and I did a similar display in India and China, when we're talking about water, because we're pretty fortunate in Canada to have large freshwater supplies, not just in our glaciers, but also in our rivers and lakes. But many countries aren't so fortunate. So there's a lot more competition for water. Even our best irrigation system now is maybe 50%. I'm not sure what you heard, if you heard yet, but we're pro 50% efficiency. So it does take a lot of water to grow a crop, and the general public are always looking at agriculture to try to improve efficiency. So just to give you an idea, this 55-liter container of water, and how much grain do you think you can grow with that? Well, about 60 grams. So you need 55 liters of water to grow 60 grams of wheat. So the ratio is 1,500 to 1. So it takes 1,500 liters of water to grow 1 liter of grain. 1,500 liters of water to grow 1 liter of grain. And when I first started doing research, that ratio was 2,500 to 1, because our varieties weren't as water use efficient as they are today. So that's changed dramatically, but it's still a big ratio, 1,500 to 1. So it takes a lot of water to produce a crop. So I just wanted to emphasize that. That's why it's very important to conserve as much as we can, because of that demand to produce that crop.
Is that an exponential curve? Like fertilizer, when you fly your first 50 pounds of fertilizer,
yeah.
It's really efficient, and then as toward, right? You know what I mean? Is it a bell
Yeah, well,
curve,
it doesn't change too much, but fertilizer obviously helps, improve that
Yeah,
efficiency.
but is water use efficiency a bell curve? Like
Oh yeah, it drops off a bit. Yeah, no, there's no question.
Yeah,
about it.
but you need a certain amount
Need a
of
minimum.
water.
You need a
There's
minimum.
a threshold amount, and
Yeah,
below that you get nothing.
You get
Right.
nothing.
So-
Yeah, yeah. So there's nothing for the first. I can't remember the numbers, but 300 or 400. It doesn't. You need a lot of water to get that first bushel.
Right. But
so-
the difference in water to grow a
Yeah.
80 bushel and a 110 bushel crop, there's actually a lot of water added for
Yeah.
that extra 30 bushels. And is
Yeah.
that efficient?
Yeah, yeah. You can answer that yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, there's diminishing
Yeah.
returns to any input.
But I think it's just important to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So maybe we've still got 5 or 10 minutes. We'll walk over to the other side, unless there's a burning question here. Or did you want to talk about your cores? Or?
We'll loop around like we
Okay,
did last
okay,
time.
okay.
So the move away from summer fallow was driven essentially by trying to get the most we can out of limited resources, especially the fixed rainfall input in a rain-fed cropping system. And this just provides you another vantage point of the different tillage technologies. This would have been the oldest summer fallow technique. This is thanks to Charles Noble, who developed his machine here in this part of the world, and then the chemical control. but still you were up against the wall because of the inefficiency of summer fallow as a means to conserve soil moisture for the succeeding crop. You lost too much of your limited water resource to evaporation. So we, especially in the black and the more humid parts of the dark brown soil zone, summer fallow has declined greatly in popularity. It's only in the driest part and on the coarser textured soils in the brown soil zone where there's still quite frequent summer fallow. Initially it was a gradual process where farmers went from summer fallowing every other year to producing 2 crops and then fallowing, and there was a lot of intertwined changes that spurred that development. One of the changes was the improvement in chemicals for weed control. You no longer had to do tillage to kill your weeds. Another advancement for sure was in the engineering of the tillage tools that we had to cultivate the land, but especially to put in the crops. And in a little bit we'll get over there and we'll talk about the continuously crop systems and some of the tillage technology. One of the things that we did is we put in, you can see on those posts over there, we've got data loggers that monitor temperature and moisture. And this shows 2 systems. We've got a modern, in the red line, low disturbance system that disturbs the soil low, so it's less, with a disc type opener. So it just cuts a narrow slot in the soil to place the seeds without exposing a lot of soil to evaporation, and it keeps a lot of the crop residue from the previous crop on the soil surface. And what that does is it attenuates the day to night swings in temperature. The high disturbance system, representative of some of our very early systems that Wayne was involved in developing, it buries a lot of the surface residues and it exposes the soil to more evaporation, so you got greater swings in temperature. During the daytime the temperatures get warmer, and at night you've got more radiative cooling, so you got more wilder swings in soil temperature. These particular sensors also measure soil moisture. Not a lot of difference. This is just in the 0 to 5 centimeter layer, so we rely on a much greater soil depth than that to buffer our crop's water supply. But the main thing it shows here is the precipitation events that we got that recharged the soil there. So in a few minutes we'll be walking through those plots and taking a closer look at the influence of that on residue coverage and soil disturbance. But before we do that, maybe Wayne would like to cover a little bit more. Some of these books, I think, are people should be aware of those.
Well, talking about history, since we are celebrating a long-term history, quite a few books have been written in the last 20 years about what's happened in the Great Plains of the U.S. and Canada. Manigat, one of the first books written, that covered the noble cultivator system and what happened in the prairies, Palliser and so on. James Gray's book, Man Against the Desert. Quite a bit of reference here to trash cover farming and what happened because of the dirty 30s and so on. Very good history. More recently there's been books written, there's about 5 or 6 now that have been written on the impact of not taking care of the land globally. And so David Montgomery, his first book, Erosion of Civilization, talks about what happened in countries in Europe, in Central America, South America, and to some extent in North America, if we don't take care of our topsoil, and the impact it has on society in terms of taxes and impact on global food supplies, and obviously we hear a lot about what's happening in Africa and so on. But it helps raise attention to the issue about managing our soil properly. As I mentioned in the 80s, when we had the drought in the 80s, Senator Sparrow traveled across the country with a number of the farm groups, many of who, Alberta Conservation Tillage Society, Saskatchewan Soil Conservation Society, and the Manitoba North Dakota No-Till Farmers Association. So they had a series of hearings across the prairies back in the early 80s when this drought was going on. And Senator Sparrow was tasked with the lead on that particular issue. And so they put together their report in 1984, Soil at Risk, and it documented how severe the problem was, that we had to change. And there had to be more support for farmers, more support for extension, better development of equipment to practice conservation tillage. Otherwise, we were going to be losing most of our topsoil in the prairies as well. So this report resulted in $30 or $40 million of additional research for extension for the conservation groups to help promote soil conservation on the prairies. So it was really a help for us to do some of the studies that I talked about earlier, and helped a lot of soil guys and engineers develop better equipment. And finally, after I retired, the University of Saskatchewan asked PFRA, the Director General of PFRA, Bernie Sontag, and I to put together a history on what we've observed over the last 50 years. So we put this book together, Landscapes Transformed on the Prairies, which basically describes everything that we've sort of talked about today and more, about the impact of farm groups, of farm leaders, of the champions of no-till. When it wasn't very popular, believe me, in the early years, to talk about that you need to cultivate the soil. So I was very proud to have been a co-author and a co-editor of this particular book on the history of conservation on the prairies with Dr. Sontag. So this book is available as well, and I can even sign an autographed copy for you if you're interested. Whatnot. But you can get it online for $10, US. But in any case, so just a bit of a history there on some of the conservation. You wanted to move down?
Okay. Any questions on that before we proceed to have a closer look at the seeding machinery? So here we have a sequence of 3 plots of spring wheat, and they are seeded with different technology that's been developed over the years. This is the least disturbance system, and this was seeded with a single disc opener. It has provisions, like most of the modern seed drills, to place to get some separation between the fertilizer band and the seed to prevent damage to the crop from high concentrations of fertilizer. But with this particular, it's with the pillar laser openers. It's made by a company in Warman, Saskatchewan, and it's the successor to the Barton opener that was popular on Flexicoil machines. I'm not an engineer, I have no endorsement of machine companies. But the end result that you can see, if you take a look down here, you can see we've got the crop put into the ground with very little residue disturbance. So what that does is it maintains that cover of residue on the soil surface, and it insulates the soil temperature against rapid swings in temperature between day and night, and it conserves soil moisture. It provides a little bit of surface roughness to reduce the evaporative loss in that early crucial establishment period. The next plot over here is the medium disturbance system, and this was seeded with it's a hoe type opener, and we've got an example of that opener on the table at the west end of the plot here. You can take a look at that when we walk past over there. But this, we've got a little bit less residues. We didn't put our instruments in this to measure temperature and moisture. There's a little bit more burial of residues. It cuts a little bit wider swath to place the seed in. Still a very popular kind of opener. That's something that a lot of producers spent their winters on, developing new and improved openers. Different openers are favored to different extents depending on what part of the prairies you're at, whether you're on an area with predominantly clay soils or whether you have more medium textured soils like these. And this farthest plot over here to the north is the high disturbance. This is the high disturbance seeding system, and this high disturbance, low surface residue coverage. So this is an example of some of the first direct seeding, no tillage equipment, some of which Wayne worked on with his colleagues in I guess it would be the 1980s. And this was more or less like a field cultivator that they use. So they've got wide sweeps, and it causes quite a bit of soil disturbance and residue burial. A lot of those systems didn't have explicit separation of the fertilizer band from the seed, but it was such a wide seed bed utilization, and fertilizer rates were probably lower in those days, that you could get away with doing it that way. But this, if you look down at the soil here, you will see more residue burial and quite a bit of bare soil. This crop we intentionally seeded a little bit late so that you could see the surface residues a little bit easier. So any questions on that? If you want to take a closer look, yeah, an example of that is the cultivator behind this plot, just on the west side here, and you can see they're pretty wide sweeps. Those aren't very common anymore. There was lots of development in the technology, the engineering to make these systems work. Some of the early air drills were abysmally poor at depth control, for example. And if you go to the pillar laser opener, for example, it's got a depth gauge on every opener, so it's a really precise depth control and separation of your fertilizer from your seed. Okay, so how are we doing with time? Should we move back towards the end of the plots?
Do you have more to cover?
I've got a few. I want to talk a little bit about soil cores, and that's it.
Okay.
Okay? This is what we call a dark brown Chernozem on loam texture soils. And I've got an example of what the early settlers in the early 1900s first were confronted with when they came. This is a plot under native grass, and you can see it's a perennial plant, so it's got perennial roots that persist from one year to the next, and we've got roots going all the way down at depth. Okay, so you can see those fine roots there. In the early days, it was all horsepower, and they used the moldboard plow. And what we have on these soils is a dark surface layer of soil, and we call that the AP horizon. It's the top layer, and it's the plow layer. So the color, oftentimes, and especially on these, we get an abrupt change in color because they were, this area was long ago covered by an ancient inland sea, and then scraped up and reworked by the effect of glaciers. This is a clustering soil deposited from standing water. But we've got lots of calcium carbonate due to our legacy. So in the subsoil, we've got calcium carbonate. That's a little bit of an acid, and it reacts with the carbonate, emits a bit of carbon dioxide. See, that is my eroded core. No, that's my summer fallow core. This is eroded core. The deeper you go, the more carbonates you get. These two are companion cores collected close to each other. This is on a continuous wheat system. So when we switch from a system that's got summer fallow, this is a core that was under summer fallow. I can tell here because it's quite wet at the bottom. There hasn't been any evapotranspiration using up that water. But the soil is pretty much full, and we can't store any more water than what's in it right now. And so that's one of the reasons why our storage efficiency with summer fallow is pretty low. Here, when you go to a reduced tillage system, you have very low soil disturbance, so you don't get, we never plow down that deep anymore under the current conditions. This actually isn't a native grassland core. This is from a study where we were trying to rebuild the soil again by putting in a perennial crop and looking at the storage of carbon from cropping with a perennial system with absolutely no tillage. We aren't producing a lot of wheat per unit of water on this system, but we're producing lots of grass forage biomass. This is another grassland core. The thickness of the soil is truncated because there was a rock there, so the changes in soil layers with depth is more compacted than the development of this soil here. This is soil from one of the long-term no-till plots that Wayne Lindwall first started working on in 1967. So it hasn't been tilled since then. Now, it was under summer fallow, so initially that system was a fallow, well, one was a fallow wheat system and one was a fallow wheat system, but there was no tillage. The summer fallow year, all the vegetation was controlled with herbicides, and we can see a little bit of accumulation in carbon here. One of the things that when you hear people talk about carbon, you have to pay attention to the chemical form of carbon, whether it is organic carbon or inorganic carbon, such as you see going into the atmosphere from here. That is an inorganic form that is derived from ancient inland seas, not necessarily derived from the plant material that's going in, whereas the organic carbon is from the roots, from the plant growth. So next I would like to point out a little bit more. This is, again, this is a winter wheat. This is a core from under winter wheat, and it shows the typical sequence of soil layers going down. You've got a pretty distinct AP layer, that's about the depth of plow, and then there's this transition, we call that the B, or the middle horizon, and then we get an accumulation where we've got a layer that's really rich in carbonates, because during 10,000 years of soil development, the carbonates move from here down and they concentrate in this zone, and then there's less carbonate down at depth. Again, the one thing with this is a much more mature winter wheat crop. They will root well below 1 meter, and you can see the roots going all the way down, fairly fine roots. But if you really want to increase soil carbon storage, you have to consider a forage, and one that's remarkable is the alfalfa. It fixes its own nitrogen, and you can see the large perennial root system going all the way down in these cores. This is actually 2 cores here. Kind of difficult. This is rain-fed alfalfa, so the soil's dry, but these roots, they'll go down many meters to the water table. And actually, one of the problems we didn't allude to, one of the drawbacks of summer falling was a disruption of the regional hydrology, and because it couldn't use all the water, that would enter the soil and recharge and flow laterally in the landscape, and oftentimes where it discharged on a side slope or something, it would bring salts to the surface, and then you were really in trouble because you couldn't grow anything there. So in a lot of areas, and especially in the high summer fallow era, they used alfalfa as an interceptor crop, because those deep roots would go down and use the water and allow the salts to move down into the soil profile. So is there any question on the soil cores, or any soil questions and how it relates to, have I missed anything, Wayne?
No, you've done well. I just wanted to add that Ben mentioned that our soils are calcareous, and we knew that early on, that they're almost self-mulching, and I think you've all noticed that yourselves in the spring, because we used to get a lot of questions. Oh, well, we get a plow sole, and I think I need to break that up with a ripper or something, and so on. But because our soils are calcareous, for one reason, they tend to self-mulch, and what happens over winter, the moisture goes right from the solid phase or ice to the vapor phase, like it never goes to the liquid phase. And so those little soil particles or the clay particles stay fluffy. Like if you go out there early in the spring after that last freeze thaw, that soil is pretty mellow and fluffy. And that's again why they're subject to more erosion if you don't have crop residue there, but it also helps loosen them up, because that freeze thaw loosens them up because they are calcareous. And the frost will penetrate down 1.5 meters, And you still got to remember, even though these cores, they look like they're very solid and there's no room for air or water, there's still 40% air in each of those cores. And just because, you know, there's root channels that are there and little pores from earthworms, water and nutrients can still penetrate, even though you think they look pretty solid and maybe it'd be helpful to plow that deep. We just didn't find any benefit to that. I guess I don't think I mentioned, I get confused because we talked to another group, but carbon sequestration, it's a hot issue as well because we are dealing with climate change, and Canada's the only country in the world now that's a net sink, that on average now we sequester 10 million tons of CO2 annually. 10 million tons of CO2 annually just on the prairies because of the adoption of 75% conservation tillage and direct seeding. In 1991, we were a net source, 7 million tons. So we were losing 7 million tons of CO2 from our prairie soils in 1991. Now we're a net sink of 10 million tons that we're storing in the soil.
Yeah,
only country in the world.
Yeah, the carbon cycle is a balance between.
What's that?
Are we storing, or are we just replacing what we already put back up
Oh,
there?
well, of course.
Yes, exactly. Since agriculture was first practiced here, we've still got a net emission of soil carbon. We lost about a third of the soil that was here under the original prairie grassland. About a third of that carbon was lost. And it's all about the balance between inputs of carbon fixed photosynthetically and outputs to decomposition. And the problem with the summer fallow system is, first of all, you've got a very compact period of time where you're photosynthesizing. It's only that 4-month period inside of 24. Whereas when we're continuous cropping, you have a much longer period of photosynthesis, of carbon input. And on the decomposition side, you have all those residues accumulated during the crop year, but during that summer fallow year, the soil is warm and moist, and those conditions are ideal and they promote decomposition of the organic matter that's there. So it's a continuous flow of carbon atoms between the atmosphere, the plants, the soil, and back to the atmosphere again. So it's challenging and fascinating to measure those flows.
Well, the food is warm and moist, and we need some input, so we're gonna break for lunch. So join me in thanking Ben and Wayne, and we'll head on the trailer